So hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome back to another discussion video for my serialised Victorian-style read-along of Charles Dickens's Bleak House. So if you don't know, I'm currently hosting a Victorian-style serialised read-along of Bleak House, reading a few chapters every month as the Victorians would have originally done. So in the month of June, we read the next 3 chapters of Bleak House. Chapter 11, Our Dear Brother, Chapter 12, On the Watch, and Chapter 13, Esther's Narrative. So let's get into them. Quite a lot happens in Our Dear Brother. We begin the chapter immediately where we left off at the end of the last chapter, where Mr. Tulkinghorn had gone into the room of Mr. Nemo and not been able to wake him up. We find out at the very beginning of this chapter that he is dead, and doctors are immediately summoned. No one can find any sign of who he is or of anything about him from his papers, and shortly after an inquest is called, at which it is ruled that Nemo met by accidental death, effectively. And in this chapter we also meet a young boy called Joe, the only person who really seems to mourn the loss of Mr. Nemo, a very young, poor crossing sweeper boy who Mr. Nemo was kind to. Before I talk about the kind of social criticism elements of this chapter, I quickly want to talk a little bit about Mr. Tulkinghorn and the way he acts in this chapter. Mr. Tulkinghorn clearly is quite interested in the proceeding and remains there for quite a long time without saying anything, and indeed he remains standing next to the chest, which perhaps of anything in the room might give a suggestion of who this man was, for a long time before Mr. Snagsby points it out, and when he does, to be sure, so there it is. Mr. Tulkinghorn does not appear to have seen it before, though he is standing so close to it, and though there is very little else, heaven knows. But of course he has noticed, and he's standing next to it and not mentioning it because he doesn't want to bring attention to himself, but he remains there because he is interested. And I think this is very interesting, especially in terms of Mr. Tulkinghorn's present here, sort of tying together different aspects of the book, tying together the Dedlock family with what's going on in Crook's house. We know very little still about Mr. Nemo, but there is this suggestion in this chapter of how utterly sad it is that he has fallen to this stage in life and that anyone can kind of get to this point. No one knows anything about him, no one cares about him save one small boy who knows so little about him. His name, the name he gives, is no one, and so few people care when he dies. The scene of his burial is so miserable, and a lot of this chapter is filled of kind of the darker stuff of Victorian London and kind of how miserable it is if you are in these circumstances. And we do get a sense that he might have had a past that was somewhat better than the state he's in now. The surgeon who is there says that he must have been a good figure when a youth, and I dare say good looking. I recollect once thinking that there was something in his manner, uncouth as it was, that denoted a fall in life. And obviously he works as a law writer for someone so impoverished. He is clearly very, very educated and his handwriting is good, etc. He can copy things very, very quickly and he works very, very hard. Indeed, Mr. Snagsby says of him, he gradually fell into job work at our place, and that is the most I know of him, except that he was a quick hand and a hand not sparing of night work, and that if you gave him out, say 5 and 40 folio on the Wednesday night, you would have it brought in on the Thursday morning. And the only other thing we really learn about Nemo in this chapter is that he was kind, especially to Joe. Joe's testimony at the inquest is rather jumbled, but this is what we do find out. That graceless creature, i.e. Joe, only knows that the dead man, whom he recognised just now by his yellow face and black hair, was sometimes hooted and pursued about the street. The one cold winter night when he, the boy, was shivering in a doorway near the crossing, the man turned to look at him and came back, and having questioned him and found that he had not a friend in the world, said, "Neither have I, not one," and gave him the price of a supper and a night's lodgings. That the man had often spoken to him since and asked him whether he slept sound at night, and now he bore cold and hunger, and whether he ever wished to die, and similar strange questions. That when the man had no money he would say in passing, "I am as poor as you today, Joe," but that when he had any he had always, as the boy most heartily believes, been glad to give him some. So we know that Mr. Nemo was kind, and also that he was incredibly unhappy that he had not a friend in the world, and the suggestion is from the questions that he asked Joe that he himself struggled to sleep and perhaps wished to die. He had bought opium for pain relief but had taken too much. The implication is that it is an accidental death, but also that this is a man who perhaps didn't care that much about whether he lived or died. Dickens is very critical of the way that people act to Nemo's death, both people in the neighbourhood who suddenly start gossiping about him and also at the inquest, and just what a kind of shoddy and informal affair the inquest is. The inquest is held at a public house. Everything is kind of makeshift and done on the spot and with quite a little formality, and the witnesses produced are not very, very good. There is There is Mrs. Piper, who goes on for a long time and pretty much says nothing. Well, as Dickens says, Mrs. Piper has a good deal to say, chiefly in parentheses and without punctuation. Whereas Joe, who is the person who actually possibly knew the dead man best, his testimony is dismissed because he is clearly uneducated and dirty and poor, and therefore they don't think that he is reliable. Inquests are indeed so generally informal that the coroner frequents more public houses than any man alive. The smell of sawdust, beer, tobacco smoke and spirits is inseparable in his vacation from death in its most awful shapes. And that kind of mingling of death and sort of run-down pubs, the informality of it and the kind of disgrace of discussing a man's death in such a place is really, really miserable, and something Dickens is definitely critical of. Even more so when we get the description of the churchyard in which he is buried. Then the active and intelligent, who has got into the morning papers as such, comes with his pauper company to Mr. Crookes and bears off the body of our dear brother here departed to a hemmed-in churchyard, pestiferous and obscene, where malignant diseases are communicated to the bodies of our dear brothers and dear sisters who have not departed, while our dear brothers and sisters who hang about official backstairs would to heaven that they had departed, are very complacent and agreeable, into a beastly scrap of ground which a Turk would reject as a savage abomination and a Caffro would shudder at. They bring our dear brother here departed to receive Christian burial. Come night, come darkness, for you cannot come too soon or stay too long by such a place as this. Come straggling lights into the window of the ugly houses, and you who do inquiry therein, do it at least with this dread scene shut out. Come flame of gas burning so sullenly above the iron gate, on which the poisoned air deposits its witch ointment slimy to the touch, it is well that you should call to every passer-by, look here. Such a miserable place to be buried. Dickens is very, very critical of the kind of pauper's burial system, the way in which the dead are treated when they don't have anyone to pay for their funeral and when no one knows who they are. It's an incredibly miserable scene, one that Dickens is critical of. You always know when Dickens starts kind of addressing the reader or particular readers of his directly that he is making a great kind of social point and complaining about the way that people are treated. It's a miserable scene and in many ways reflects the misery of Nemo's life. So I think that's all I had to say on that chapter, which leads us on to chapter 12, On the Watch. In chapter 12, On the Watch, we return once more to the Dedlocks at Chesney Wold. We get to see the kind of grand society around them, as well as being a bit further introduced to some of the servants who work at Chesney Wold, including the lady's maid of Lady Dedlock. On the way to Chesney Wold, Lady Dedlock and Sir Leicester hear from Mr. Tulkinghorn, and he mentions that he has been inquiring into the writer of the affidavit that Lady Dedlock noticed the handwriting of, and that he has something to tell her about it, and that is all. Upon which Lady Dedlock immediately decides that she wants to get out the carriage and to walk, and Sir Leicester walks with her. Later, when Mr. Tulkinghorn himself turns up at Chesney Wold, he tells Lady Dedlock that he has found the man dead. And there continues to be a kind of unresolved tension between Lady Dedlock and Mr. Tulkinghorn. So, points of interest in this chapter, there are quite a lot as always. One thing I think it's worth noting is the way that Lady Dedlock reacts when she meets Rosa, who Mrs. Rouncewell has been training up as a servant, because Lady Dedlock is in general someone who doesn't display very, very much emotion. She is bored, she is careless, and she doesn't show any kind of emotion or affection for people, really. And yet, when she sees Rosa, she beckons her with even an appearance of interest. "Why, do you know how pretty you are, child?" she says, touching her shoulder with her two forefingers. And even asks Rosa her age, more interest really than Lady Dedlock shows to anyone. And I think it's also worth looking at the way that Lady Dedlock's servants view her, because that can tell us quite a lot about her as a character. That evening in the housekeeper's room, Rosa can do nothing but murmur Lady Dedlock's praises. She is so affable, so graceful, so beautiful, so elegant, has such a sweet voice and such a thrilling touch that Rosa can feel it yet. Mrs. Rouncewell confirms all this, not without personal pride, reserving only the one point of affability. Mrs. Rouncewell is not quite sure as to that. Heaven forbid that she should say a syllable in dispraise of any member of that excellent family, above all of my lady, whom the whole world admires, but if my lady would only be a little more free, not so cold and distant, Mrs. Rouncewell thinks she would be more affable. "'Tis almost a pity," Mrs. Rouncewell adds, "that my lady has no family. If she had had a daughter now, a grown young lady, to interest her, I think she would have had the only kind of excellence she wants." This implication that there might be some want of a family in Lady Dedlock's life perhaps also goes a little way to explaining why she does feel an interest in Rosa, because Lady Dedlock's maid is rather an interesting character, and certainly one I think it's worth keeping an eye on, so I will read the description we first get of her. "My lady's maid is a Frenchwoman of 32, from somewhere in the southern country around Avignon and Marseille, a large-eyed brown woman with black hair, who would be handsome but for a certain feline mouth and a general uncomfortable tightness of face, rendering the jaws too eager eager and the skull too prominent. There is something indefinably keen and wan about her anatomy, and she has a watchful way of looking out of the corners of her eyes without turning her head, which could be pleasantly dispensed with, especially when she is in an ill humour and near knives. What a great line, Dickens, what a great line. She is clearly rather jealous of Rosa and pretends to find it very entertaining that Lady Dedlock has made such a fuss of Rosa when in fact she is clearly not very happy about it. The relationship between Lady Dedlock and Mr. Tulkinghorn is kind of at the centre of this chapter, and she spends a lot of the first half of the chapter watching for him and looking out for his appearance until he does arrive. When he does arrive, he tells the story of finding Mr. Nemo dead. Celesta Dedlock does not want to hear the story, not thinking it fit for Lady Dedlock's feminine ears, but Lady Dedlock is quite intrigued and wants to hear more. And then I want to read the last paragraph of this chapter just because I think it's quite telling about the kind of tension between them. Just before this, Lady Dedlock has asked Mr. Tulkinghorn to open the door for her. Mr. Tulkinghorn does so with deference and holds it open while she passes out. She passes close to him with her usual fatigued manner and insolent grace. They meet again at dinner, again the next day, again for many days in succession. Lady Dedlock is always the same exhausted deity, surrounded by worshippers and terribly liable to be bored to death, even while presiding at her own shrine. Mr. Tulkinghorn is always the same speechless repository of noble confidence, so oddly out of place and yet so perfectly at home. They appear to take as little note of one another as any two people enclosed within the same walls could. But whether each evermore watches and suspects the other, evermore mistrustful of some great reservation, whether each is evermore prepared at all points for the other, and never to be taken unawares, what each would give to know how much the other knows, all this is hidden for the time in their own hearts. Dickens is such a good foreshadower of tension to come. So yes, I think that's all I have to say on that one. And now we move on to chapter 13, Esther's narrative. In chapter 13, the next part of Esther's narrative, various things happen, including Richard finally making up his mind rather spontaneously about the profession he wants to have. He has decided that he wants to be a surgeon, and as such he is put in contact with a family in London who can educate him and brought to London to meet Mr. Bayham Badger. While in London, Esther is rather plagued by Mr. Guppy, who begins to stalk her and turn up everywhere where she is, rather unpleasantly. And we also have a dinner party at the Bayham Badgers, where Mr. Bayham Badger is very, very proud of the fact that he is his wife's third husband and keeps on going on about how impressive her first two husbands were. And at the end of that evening, Ada confides to Esther that Richard has told her that he loves her and that she loves him too and that they would like to be married, although they know they are both very young and it won't be for a while. Esther, being as fond of them as she is, and in a weird way they're kind of guardians though she's about their own age, takes it upon herself to tell Mr. Jarndyce. They tell Mr. Jarndyce about Ada and Richard's relationship, and while he is surprised, he is pleased and kind of hoped that would happen eventually, though possibly not quite yet. And then at the very end of the chapter, Esther tells us that what she didn't tell us earlier was that also at their dinner party there was rather a nice looking young man that she quite liked. But of course she didn't tell us that earlier because Esther is a little bit unreliable sometimes. Many things to say about this chapter. Let's look a little bit at Richard's character. Richard is indecisive and spontaneous at once, and Mr. Jarndyce says that he thinks this is very much to do with the lawsuit. How much of this indecision of character is chargeable on that incomprehensible heap of uncertainty and procrastination on which he has been thrown from his birth, I don't pretend to say. The Chancery, among its other sins, is responsible for some of it, I can plainly see. And yet Richard's education seems to be partly responsible for it as well. At school he has learnt nothing but Latin verses, which doesn't really help him decide what he wants to do with his life. It's not a very practical education. He really has no idea what he wants to do until Mr. Jarndyce suggests surgeon, and Richard cries, "That's the thing, sir," because he immediately takes a fancy to it, even though he hasn't really thought it through very much. Richard definitely has that kind of personality. I sometimes think that Richard is a bit like Mr. Bingley, and that Richard is what Mr. Bingley would be if he didn't have lots of money. And even when Mr. Jarndyce tries to get him to think seriously about it, he kind of sticks to it, but without much purpose. Mr. Jarndyce took great pains to talk to him seriously and to put to his good sense not to deceive himself in so important a matter. Richard was a little grave after these interviews, but invariably told Ada and me that it was all right, and then began to talk about something else. Let's also have a chat about Mr. Guppy, who behaves in quite a poor way in this chapter and sort of follows Esther about and makes her feel incredibly uncomfortable. Not exactly threatened, but certainly definitely not at her ease. She begins to see him all over London, looking miserable, and whenever they end up at the theatre, he is there too. I really cannot express how uneasy this made me, to know that that absurd figure was always gazing at me, and always in that demonstrative state of despondency, put such a constraint upon me that I did not like to laugh at the play, or to cry at it, or to move, or to speak. I seemed able to do nothing naturally. And she considers her options. She thinks about telling Mr. Jarndyce or Richard, and then thinking that actually she doesn't want to kind of get Mr. Guppy into trouble, and she still feels feels a little bit guilty and therefore she doesn't do anything about it. And then we have the dinner party at the Badgers. Mr. and Mrs. Bay and Badger are characters that like no one save Dickens would have created. They're so thoroughly Dickensian. Here's a weird obsession with her previous husbands that she's also very, very happy to talk about, and the descriptions of both of them are excellent. Mrs. Badger was surrounded in the drawing room by various objects, indicative of her painting a little, playing the piano a little, playing the guitar a little, playing the harp a little, singing a little, working a little, reading a little, writing poetry a little, and botanising a little. She was a lady of about 50, I should think, youthfully dressed and of a very fine complexion. If I add to the list of her accomplishments that she rouged a little, I do not mean that there was any harm in it. I want to talk, of course, a little bit about Ada and Richard and their relationship, which kind of comes to a head, and their kind of affection for each other comes out very early on in the book, actually. Often in a Dickens book, or often in a 19th century book, you would think it would take a little bit longer for them to come together in this way, but obviously they are very young, and Richard still needs to establish himself in order that they could have a proper settled married life. I do enjoy the relationship between Esther and Ada, especially because Ada thinks she's kind of telling this great secret to Esther, and Esther's just sat there, well, like I knew this already. Ada says, "I know it's very foolish, we are both so young, but he says that he loves me dearly, Esther." "Does he indeed?" said I. "I never heard of such a thing. Why, my pet of pets, I could have told you that weeks and weeks ago." I think to look at Esther's relationship with Ada and Richard is quite interesting too, because she is kind of the best friend of both of them, and I'll talk as well as the book goes on about how much I like Richard and Esther's relationship, especially because I feel like we don't get many kind of close female-male friendships within Victorian literature, and this is an example of a really, really nice one. I like that they work very well as a trio, even though obviously Ada and Richard are now a couple. And I like that they both kind of defer to her and are very, very fond of her as well, and kind of view her not in a guardian in the same way as Mr. Jarndyce is, but kind of as a guardian over them too, and a guardian of their interests, and as someone just that tiny bit older that they can look up to. They brought a chair on either side of me and put me between them, and really seemed to have fallen in love with me instead of one another. They were so confiding and so trustful and so fond of me. They went on in their own wild way for a little while. I never stopped them. I enjoyed it too much myself, and then we were gradually fell to considering how young they were, and how there must be a lapse of several years before this early love could come to anything, and how it could come to happiness only if it were real and lasting, and inspired them with a steady resolution to do their duty to each other with constancy, fortitude and perseverance, always for the other's sake. Well, Richard said he would work his fingers to the bone for Ada, and Ada said she would work her fingers to the bone for Richard, and they called me all sorts of endearing and sensible names, and we sat there advising and talking half the night. Finally, before we parted, I gave them my promise to speak to their cousin John tomorrow. Interesting, of course, that neither of them go to speak to Mr. Jarndyce about it, but they send Esther. I do love the scene that follows, especially Mr. Jarndyce's reaction to when Esther says that Ada and Richard have told each other that they've fallen in love with each other, because Mr. Jarndyce is not surprised at the occurrence, but he says, "Already?" and is astonished. Not at all astonished that it would happen, but that it would happen quite so soon. And he makes them a good speech, pointing out how young they are and how they must both be very sensible about this attachment. Pointing out that it must not just be constancy in love to each other, but also constancy in their lives and their ability to make a shared life together. Constancy in love is a good thing, but it means nothing and is nothing without constancy in every kind of effort. If you have the abilities of all the great men, past and present, you could do nothing well without sincerely meaning it and setting about it. You entertain the supposition that any real success in things great or in small ever was or could be, ever will or can be wrested from fortune by fits and starts. Leave that wrong idea here, or leave your cousin Ada here. Basically what Mr. Jarndyce is saying to Richard, that if he pins his hope on the case rather than on his own efforts, he will never be able to marry Ada. And finally, I will end by quickly quoting the final paragraph of this chapter, Esther's admission that she has been a little bit of an unreliable narrator. "I have omitted to mention in its place that there was someone else at that family dinner party. It was not a lady, it was a gentleman. It was a gentleman of a dark complexion, a young surgeon. He was rather reserved, but I thought him very sensible and agreeable. At least Ada asked me if I did not, and I said yes." So, I think that is all I have to say about the 3 chapters of Bleak House that we read in June. In the month of July, we will be reading the next few chapters, which are Chapter 14, Deportment, Chapter 15, Bell Yard, and Chapter 16, Tom All Alones. Please let me know down in the comments if you enjoyed this month's chapters of Bleak House. I certainly did, and I'm sure I will be enjoying the next month's chapters too. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.